Organized religion is a sham and a crutch for weak-minded people who need strength in numbers. I used to be an atheist. I used to believe what Jesse said. But I don't anymore, and I'm here today to share with you why. My name is Rick Allen, and unfortunately I have to start like I did last week with that some of the slides might be hard to read. It's tuned for projector screens, not for a TV online. So you can thank COVID-19 for that while you try to read those. There's 3 things you need to know about me. I studied the evidence, and now I'm a Christian. I'm a skeptic. I question everything. And I love my family. And I use every speaking opportunity to show them off. And I do that by showing the roadside attractions, the quirky little things on the side of the road that the quirky dad forces the family to stop on while on road trips. Things like, one of my personal favorite, the world's largest vacuum in the upper left, the largest tooth, a wall of boom boxes, and it might be hard to see, but in the bottom right picture, that's actually the country's only quad diamond crisscross intersection for trains, and I think it's one of the best family pictures we ever took. Last week, I shared the start of my journey, and I shared the case for God. Today, I'm going to talk about the case for Jesus, and we're going to talk about crossing the chasm of religions. Just like last week, I'll be covering a lot today, a lot of data, sharing facts, a few videos, a lot to take in. Sit back, relax, prepare to absorb. This will not be your typical service. My name is Rick Allen. I'm a computer architect. I've been married for 27 years, 2 kids, twins. And I'm a Menominee Falls native. Last year, I showed the schools I attended. Last week, I spelled it without looking. Today, I remember my phone number from 1970, 414-251-8731. And that was the original and the cool area code, by the way, not this 262 stuff. And I'm a Packer fan. I am convinced by the evidence I showed last week that a supernatural power exists, which I call God. On to the next question. Which religion is true, if any of them? They all claim to be the right religion, and the chasm is wide. And aren't they basically the same anyways? Well, not on the fundamentals. Does God exist? What's our destiny? Our salvation? Now, they could all be wrong. That's certainly possible. But they can't all be right, because they all make exclusive claims. I looked at the major faiths, and one stood out for me. The evidence of Christianity stood out. A radical change occurred, and it's well documented. The Bible is a history book far more accurate than I ever expected. We have truthful eyewitness testimony, and miracles are possible. Last week, I touched on all lines of evidence, but at a cursory level due to time. I'm going to do the same thing again today for the same reason. It wasn't a single piece of evidence. It was the cumulative, the coherent nature of the evidence that formed a more complete picture, more so than anything else I found in the chasm. So let's begin, as I almost fall over. A radical change occurred in history. Many Jews left a 4,000-year-old religion. I can't overemphasize the radical change here. The traditions that are listed here were turned on their head. Cowards were transformed into proclaimers against their own religion. Gentiles started following a Jew. That was radical. Paul, a main New Testament figure, taught in the Jewish synagogues. To sum it up, the Jewish people were good with God. They were God's chosen nation. This was a radical change. And the Roman Empire radically changed. The most radical of all, after years of persecution, Christianity becomes the established religion. The date system of our world changed. BC before Christ and AD after Christ in the year of our Lord. And finally, the world changed. Hospitals, orphanages, charities, universities, created primarily by Christians. And our nation, the United States of America, a strong Christianity influence. What is the reason for this radical change? A man named Jesus. H.G. Wells, a historian, says, "I am a historian. I am not a believer. But I must confess, as a historian, this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history." Well, what did Jesus do or say to cause this radical change? He had no money. He never wrote a book. No politics. He stayed local. He had radical preaching, a Jew preaching anti-Jewish customs, and he had a horrible and embarrassing death. So something doesn't add up here. The story says he did miracles and was resurrected, and this caused the radical change. As a skeptic, far too easy to dismiss. It's folklore, it's legend, it's all made up. It's no different than any other religion. The truth was, I hadn't investigated any of this to justify that conclusion. So I researched. Let me show you what I found. What historical evidence do we have? We have three sources. We have unfriendly sources, those writings outside the Bible that did not support or endorse Christianity. We have early church leaders, and we have the Bible. We're going to start with the unfriendlies. As a skeptic, that's where I started, because I am not going to start with the Bible. So I started with the unfriendlies, right? Those secular sources that did not support the movement. The unfriendly sources I have listed here, they combine to tell a story. And here is the story that they tell.
In fact, we can almost reconstruct the gospel just from early, non-Christian sources. Jesus was called the Christ, did magic, led Israel into new teachings, and was hanged on Passover for them in Judea, but claimed to be God and would return, which his followers believed, worshiping him as God.
So I'd love to show the actual text of all of these, because seeing it in context made a real difference for me. It was much more tangible. Well, in the time we have, let's just look at one of them. This is Pliny the Younger. He was a governor of a Roman province, and we have 247 personal letters from him and 121 letters with the Emperor Trajan. Extremely detailed writer. Others quote his work as a goldmine of information. He writes, "They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition." That superstition can be assumed to be the resurrection. And then as a skeptic, one of the things that bugged me is, well, why isn't there more? I mean, it really bugged me. Well, today, a text survives unless it's destroyed. In antiquity, a text disappears unless it's saved. It turns out, for most ancient people, even important ones, there's very little textual evidence. In some cases, none at all. Jesus was an obscure figure. The amount of material on Jesus is actually far more than most, if not all, ancient figures. So, quick here on the early leaders. It's another source of evidence for the radical change. Many of them were taught by the disciples, the eyewitnesses themselves, and they wrote down what they were taught. And it adds detail to the story. Next, we have the Bible. And I take a quick pause here because as a skeptic, I didn't think that this was trustworthy. The writers had a bias, certainly, right, when they wrote this. Well, the Roman writers certainly had a bias. It was just the other way. Bias actually does not make a story untrue. Otherwise, you have to be prepared to throw out everything. At the very least, the Bible adds to the story historically. Looking at the New Testament, there's 27 ancient books that are collected together, and each can be considered a history book. It adds an incredible amount of detail in history. But the question comes back to, can we trust it? I mean, as a history book. Well, fiction has made-up places, made-up people, and vague details. Nonfiction, real people, real places, and explicit details. Taking a good close look at the Bible, what do we see? We see tons of real places, confirmed by archaeology. Shown here are examples of what used to be thought of as errors in the Bible that have then been proved correct. And notably, they found evidence of Pontius Pilate. Some thought he never existed. Remember when I talked about figures, there's no writings? There are no writings of Pontius Pilate. They also found an ankle bone with a nail through it. It's the first actual evidence of a crucifixion. And, interestingly enough, it was found in a tomb complex, which was evidence and shows that a crucified victim can actually be given a proper burial. It's actually estimated that only 20% of the Holy Land has been excavated. So we may find much more. And we find real people named all over the place. And they're qualified by their title or by their location, where they're from. The book of Luke alone names 95 people, 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without error. This is Sir William Ramsay, one of the greatest archaeologists of his time. He believed that the New Testament was written in the mid-200s. He became an archaeologist primarily to refute Luke and the Bible. He ended up reversing his entire view. He says Luke is a historian of the first rank. In short, this author should be placed along with the greatest of historians. And note, this was in the early 1900s. There have been many, many things discovered since then. And we have explicit details. Luke records a trip by ship from Caesarea to Rome. Here's a map of that trip. How do you suppose they created that map? From the explicit details in his writings. This is an example of Luke describing some of the trip. And it's these details that let them create a map. He even accurately describes the direction of the prevailing winds off the coast. He says, when the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed under the lee. Now, I found this pretty interesting. It's kind of an interesting story. Luke writes about their shipwreck. He says, about midnight, the sailors suspected they were nearing land. I found that interesting. Why did they suspect they were nearing land? Well, it was midnight, so it was probably dark, and They most likely heard waves crashing on the shore. That's why they suspected it. And since they thought they were close, they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on down, they took a sounding again, and they found 15 fathoms. They let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So 20 fathoms equals 150 feet. 15 fathoms equals 90 feet. And this is really interesting. They found a route that matches those depths. And they found 4 anchors. Now, 3 of them had already been melted down before they figured this out. But 1 has been preserved, and it does date to the 1st century. Both Luke and John report medical conditions. Luke records sweating blood. John records that there was water coming out of a hole in Jesus' chest. The early church fathers actually struggled with these. It didn't seem possible. Some suggested it was allegory or symbolic. Well, medically, we now know these are actually possible. They didn't know that. So clearly, the Bible is a work of nonfiction. This is J. Warner Wallace. I mentioned him last week. He was instrumental in my journey. He's a cold case detective for 20 years. He solved some of the toughest, coldest crimes. He's somewhat famous. He's been on Dateline. He was a strong atheist. He ridiculed his Christian officers. His wife got into Christianity, and he decided he was going to use his cold case skills to refute Christianity. So things like the events are in a distant past, there's no living eyewitnesses, and there's little forensic evidence. He wrote 2 books. They were both great. He's actually written more since then. But the Cold Case Christianity book opened my eyes to something I hadn't seen before. The Gospels record eyewitness testimony. They're recording what they saw in their own eyes. This was actually a game changer for me because I hadn't seen it. And we convict in a court of law based on eyewitness testimony. There's no doubt that they claim to be eyewitnesses. They've seen, they've heard, they've touched, they've looked. But are they trustworthy? We're going to look at 5 things that point to trustworthiness. Is the story authentic and did it not grow? Are the stories inconsistent? And yes, inconsistency actually points to truth. We'll talk about that. Interwoven stories, embarrassing stories, and the character of the witnesses. So our first line is about, did the story grow? This was 2,000 years ago. Didn't it just grow like the telephone game? If you guys know the game, you say something to someone and they whisper it and they whisper it and they whisper it, and at the end you laugh because it's so different than the beginning. That was my skepticism and a big concern of mine. But again, the evidence shows otherwise. Like the telephone game, we have a story. And it happened in 30 AD. Later, they wrote down what happened. And we have the original. And we have copies of copies of copies of those originals. Are the copies accurate? Are they even close to the originals? If you research this problem, you'll learn about something called textual criticism. It's a discipline that looks at ancient literature from Homer's Iliad to Plato to the Bible, all literature. And it determines how accurate the copies we have are. We don't have originals of any of those things. It looks at 3 things. How many copies exist? How short is the time gap from the original to the copies we have? And how significant are the differences amongst the copies? So cutting to the chase on a couple of these. Number 1, the number of copies is extremely large, thousands more than other ancient literature. The time gap is extremely short, hundreds of years shorter than other ancient writings. I'm glossing over these two. Why? Because they simply really didn't impress me very much as a skeptic. Maybe they should have, but they didn't. They were just numbers. It was number 3, the differences amongst the copies, that bothered me. I'm going to introduce 2 experts here. They're going to help with this inconsistency problem. We have Bart Ehrman, a pretty famous New Testament scholar, and we have Bruce Metzger, also a New Testament scholar. Now, Bruce was actually Bart's professor. Much of what Bart has learned is from Bruce. Both were devout Christians. But Bart turned to atheism, primarily over the issue of pain and suffering. So we're talking about number 3 here, the differences amongst the copies. So Bart Ehrman actually wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, and it's a book all about these inconsistencies. In the book, he says, there are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Whoa, that is pretty startling and pretty powerful. But it's not, are there differences? That's what Bruce is calling out in this book. Yes, there are differences. It's how significant are the differences. That's what textual criticism looks at. And if you dig a little deeper, if you look in the appendix of that book, you're going to find this. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger, his professor, his position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by the variance in the manuscript of the New Testament. As a matter of fact, only 1% of the differences affect any meaning at all, and none affect the Christian doctrine. The differences, it turns out, are not significant. Then I had an aha moment. And it was huge for me when it dawned on me. When you play the telephone game and the stories grow, everything in the story grows. Everything in the story becomes corrupt. The Bible contains the story for the radical change and all that other nonfiction evidence I showed earlier. If it grew over time, everything would be corrupted. It could not be selective to the Christian story. But that's not what we see. Rather, everything is extremely accurate. The radical story could not have grown independently of all these other things. So in summary, there's pretty powerful evidence that the story is authentic. We have many, many copies. We have a very short time gap. We have insignificant differences. And my aha moment, the fact that everything would be corrupted. So, okay, it hasn't grown. Is it truthful? Well, number 2, the stories are not consistent with each other. There's different versions of the same story. Well, as a skeptic, that wasn't credible at all then, right? Here's a video from Warner Wallace, the man I mentioned, the detective, and he talks about this problem.
I never flinched for a minute on the differences I saw between accounts. That didn't bother me. I had other issues, but that wasn't one of them. And I'll tell you why, because by this time, at 35, I had been working multiple eyewitness accounts for nearly a decade. And I realized early on that no 2 eyewitnesses ever agree. Ever. It could happen right now. It could happen while we're creating this tape. And do you know that you'll get 2 witnesses who will disagree about what happened 5 minutes ago? This happens all the time. There's variation between the resurrection accounts, absolutely. And that gave me great confidence because it's exactly the kind of variation I would expect to see if the resurrection accounts are real eyewitness accounts. And yes, they vary exactly to the degree I would expect them to.
So the stories are inconsistent, and it points to truthful eyewitness testimony. Now, number 3, I call this section interwoven. It's when different accounts can be pieced together, these inconsistent stories, they can be pieced together to fill in details and complete the story. Let's use an example. This is Mr. Groom. And I ask him, tell me about your wedding. So he says, yeah, let's see. We got married at Church XYZ on Main Street in the year 2000. And I remember that because it's close to where I grew up. That's why he remembers. So I asked the bride the same question. Now, no offense here, but it's just something I've noticed, that women tend to be a little more talkative. So I get a longer story. Let's pull out the relevant details. She says, I remember the pastor was John Smith. He was my youth pastor when I was in high school. That's why I remember it. Well, we can weave those stories together. And if John Smith was a pastor at Church XYZ in the year 2000, they support each other, and it signals that they're truthful. Here's an example from the Bible. John says, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Why does Pilate ask him, are you the king of the Jews? John doesn't elaborate, but Luke does. Luke says, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, our king. As they were taking him to Pilate, he claims to be a king, and that explains why Pilate would ask. There's many more identified. There's a couple of books written just on this topic. Number 4, we have the embarrassment criteria. That made-up stories usually glorify the author. And this is true of all literature again. It's a common test, not just for the Bible. What do we see in the New Testament? We see a number of embarrassments of the authors themselves. They never get it, they fall asleep, they're scolded by Jesus. And then on the right, there's a few to call out. Women as witnesses. Now, I may not agree with it, but in the first century, women's testimony was simply not considered valid. And the leader is killed. Death of a leader is embarrassing. And the resurrection. The Greeks thought it was foolish. And Paul calls it a stumbling block to the Jews. Remember those Jews that converted? There's absolutely no reason to include these, unless, of course, they were true. How about the character of the witnesses? Maybe they were just lying. Well, if they were lying, it was a conspiracy. And there's a number of elements for a conspiracy to be successful. You have to have the ability to communicate, you have to have a short time span, strong relationship amongst the liars, and you have to have a little pressure to confess. So what do we see with the eyewitnesses? Well, the exact opposite. Primitive communication methods, lasted for decades, complete strangers, and they were aggressively persecuted. This is Charles Colson. He was convicted as part of the Watergate scandal, which was a government scandal with President Nixon, where the president himself actually had to resign. This is interesting what he says. I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me that 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. But for the sake of argument, let's assume they were lying. What was their reason? What was their motive? There's actually 3 main motives to lie: greed, desire for the opposite sex, or power. And what do we see with the eyewitnesses? They rejected all material wealth, the opposite of greed. There's no evidence of desire. It's the opposite, for many of them took vows of celibacy. And many died for their belief. And you can say, but wait, lots of people die for what they believe. Take 911, for example. Yes, it's true. Some people die for what they think is true. But that's the key there. They're dying for what they've been told, what they've read. These were eyewitnesses. They died for what they saw with their own eyes. They didn't flinch. They never changed their story. And when I put this test to other religious leaders, they don't fare so well. Warner Wallace asks 4 questions to qualify or disqualify an eyewitness. Were they there? Yes, they were. Has the story changed over time? It has not changed. Is there corroborating testimony? There is. And is there any evidence of bias? There's not. So there's strong evidence the gospel writers were eyewitnesses and they are telling the truth. But part of their story is miracles. The resurrection, the biggest miracle probably of all. As a skeptic, miracles are not possible. If you could part water while fishing, that is a miracle. This is a survey done by Business Wire in 2004. 35% of Americans have seen a miracle. 35%. Put a number to that. That's over 100 million people who say they've seen a miracle. Perhaps more interesting, the survey also showed that physicians, educated, respected professionals, 55% of them have seen a miracle. In a court of law, we will convict based on eyewitness testimony, like physicians, but we will discount it for miracles. Greg Keener wrote a book, actually 2 books. It's a 2-volume set, over 1,200 pages, thousands of cases of miracles documented. And this is Philip Yancey. He's an author, and he quotes a physician who read the miracles book. I'm not sure why he didn't want to be named, but it's just a physician. And he says, in most other cases of these miracles, I could see alternative, naturalistic explanations. But most is not the same thing as all, not by a long shot. And it was the minority that I found to be stunning and couldn't just be dismissed. If just one miracle is possible, if just one of these is true out of thousands of them, then miracles are possible. And I thought about this. If a person claimed to be God, if someone came up to you and said, I'm God, what would it take for you to believe them? Perhaps miracles. So back to the radical change. The reason given is the resurrection. Miracles are possible, so the resurrection is possible. But is it the best explanation? What are the alternatives? Here are the most popular ones. He was revived later, Jesus, off the cross. He faked his death. The body was moved. An imposter died instead of him. They hallucinated, or the body was discarded. And each can be disqualified for a number of reasons. This is small. I get it. I'm not going to read them all. And the reason is because all but one theory can be disqualified for the same 2 reasons. With any of these 5 theories, it means the disciples lied. The disciples said they saw a resurrected Jesus. If any one of these theories is actually correct, the disciples knew it, and they lied that he was resurrected. And that means it's a conspiracy, and we already talked about why that isn't reasonable. And if one of these theories is what happened, would it transform them? Only if they really believed Jesus died and resurrected can you explain this kind of behavior. That leaves the hallucination theory. If they did hallucinate, it's possible it transformed them because then they thought he actually resurrected. Here's some issues with that theory. First of all, many people hallucinating the same thing at once, there's no evidence that's ever happened. As a matter of fact, the Navy SEALs go through grueling, horrible training to the point of hallucinating. They're in it together. They're in the same training. Their hallucinations are not even close to the same thing. It also happened to multiple people on multiple occasions. And it doesn't account for the empty tomb, the growing movement, or the fact that Paul said he saw Jesus later. We can make up alternative theories all day long. It's simply not what they said happened. And what they said they saw caused a radical change. The evidence had piled up. The history tells us a story. It has all the qualities of a nonfiction story. The eyewitnesses are trustworthy, and miracles are possible. But that's just Christianity. What about all those others? Well, again, they're all exclusive. They all make exclusive claims. And as such, Christianity is actually radically different than them in many ways. In other religions, there's no radical change like Christianity. The written works, if they have them, fall short historically and in accuracy. The leader and the leaders fall short in terms of greed, desire, and power. Their stories aren't as cumulative and coherent. They have different views on salvation and purpose and destiny. And there's a claim of divinity. Jesus claimed to be God, and the people knew he claimed it. No other leader has made that claim. And this final one here, mentioned earlier, but salvation, in all other religions, you have to work, you have to obey, you have to perform to obtain your salvation. Christianity is the only one that is given as a gift. So was it time to give in? Do I follow the evidence where it leads? Oh, it's difficult, it's hard, because it requires a life change. It's not about me. I have to forgive, serve others. I have to love my neighbors and my enemies. You have to see some of my neighbors. And I have another problem. I have a fear that prevents me from making decisions. But first, I just wanted to do some real fears for fun. There's a fear of water, aquaphobia. There's a fear of beards. It's called Pogonophobia. It's a real fear. There's a fear of irregular patterns or clusters of small holes. Trypophobia. Those are not my fears. And by the way, here's a really useless fact for you. That fear was the most searched fear on the internet in these states. Go figure. Nope. My fear is the fear of being wrong. And it paralyzes me. Just ask my family. If I buy something, I'm worrying so long that it's going to go on sale. I'm a big old second guesser. Regarding this Christianity thing, if I could get past all doubt, if I could be certain, I'd give in. Well, back to law enforcement. Let's read these jury instructions. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced the defendant is guilty. Juries sentence people, sometimes to death, with some doubt, a reasonable doubt, as long as they are firmly convinced. I realized I had to apply this here. I'll never be 100% certain, never. But I was firmly convinced based on the evidence. So I followed it. I followed the evidence. I crossed the chasm and became a Christian. Looking back, I can say the answers were not hard to find, but they were hard to accept. Are you skeptical of Christianity, this religious stuff? Do you have doubts that hold you back? Well, perhaps the evidence today and what I've shared, you could cross the chasm with me. It's not easy. I still have doubts. I still struggle with things like prayer and suffering and the fact that all don't go to heaven. And I'll tell you, there are times I really don't want to be a Christian. But I keep coming back to the evidence and this pesky little thing called the truth. Thank you for your attention. This is my website, my email address. I'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback. So have a great Sunday. God bless each one of you. Thank you.